Welcome, everybody, for another edition of Drunk Agile. With us, as always, in the background, the star of the show, Nisha the Beautiful. Hi, Nisha. The Yogi Berra of Agile, Prateek Singh, and my name is Daniel Vacanti. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. Prateek, what are you drinking?
Oh, I have my Glendronach.
That's the new one.
That's the new one. That's batch 8.
One better than the batch 7 that you had?
Yes, one better than the batch 7, because that was actually 1.1 better, because that was 59.9%. This is 61%. So it's 1.1 better. Yeah, Pedro Jimenez classes, Pedro Jimenez and Oro's Sherry casks, cask strength. That's where we are today.
Great, and I just cracked open a brand new Blanton's that I got from this really good guy. None of you out there, you won't know him. You won't know who he is. I could say the name, but you wouldn't recognize the name. But just got my brand new bottle of Blanton's that I'm so happy about. Just opened it, so 93 proof. I don't know. I could read what it is or whatever, but it's Blanton's. It's good. That's all you need to know. Tonight. Oh, cheers, everybody! Cheers. Hope you have your favorite glass with you as well. Okay, for tonight's episode, we're going to start working through some questions that we get from our viewers. So number one, thank you everybody who has submitted a question. We will try and get through all the ones that you submit as quickly as possible. This question is from, you have the email in front of you. This question's from
yes,
Mark?
From Mark Parkes. Parks.
Apologize if we murdered your name there, Mark. But Mark was asking about how do we go about setting work in progress limits. So Mark just watched our definition of workflow video and had a question about, okay, I get this whole definition of workflow, but when we're starting out, if this is a team that's brand new to Kanban, how do they go about setting work in progress limits? Prateek, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, so there are so many ways, but to begin with,
I'm going to cut you off. Just cut you off right there. Right, I'm going to let you say something because what you said right there again. So Prateek, if everybody's noticed, Prateek does these things where he says these really big statements, but he kind of just glosses over them. So what were like the 5 words you just said?
There are so many ways.
So I guess that's 4 words or whatever. That's number one. Is it 5?
5.
Yeah, whatever. There are so many ways to do this. A lot of you out there may have been told that there's only one way to set work in progress limits in Kanban. There are not. There are many ways, and we will cover most of them, or a lot of them, I guess I should say. So sorry to interrupt you there, but
yes.
Is that where I
was going with there are so many ways was that just to go to Mark's exact question, he says, when a team has a definition of workflow in place, how can they find WIP limits for the activities in their flows? And in brackets, he says columns. And how should they maintain those WIP limits? So that first part of the activities in their flows columns, that is one way. That is one way to set WIP limits, to WIP limit your system is go to each column, go to each activity, and set a number on top of it that says, this is the number of things we'll allow to be in here.
Right. And let's just stress that that's not necessarily the best way.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of people might argue that's kind of an anti-pattern way of setting work in progress limits, but maybe we'll get to that later in the video. Okay, so how would I do? Let's say that's the approach I want to take. I've got my activities mapped out, my definition of workflow, activities mapped to columns. How do I set work in progress limits on those columns?
Even before we get to setting work in progress limits, first thing I want to say is you are going to be wrong. The first thing we have to accept is whatever work in progress limits you set are going to be wrong. So we're not shooting for perfection here. That initial work in progress limits that you set are going to be wrong. That being said, now we can talk about what gives us the best guess at what those should be. And there are multiple patterns you can use here. The easiest that people usually find are things like we have a development column where mostly coding happens. There are 3 people on the team who usually write code. So I don't want people to work on more than 2 things at a time. I'm going to do 3 times 2 is 6. That's my WIP limit for the developing column. And then move on to the next specialty, move on to the next specialty, do it that way. That is as decent a starting point as any. Now I use the number 2, you can use the number 1.5, you can use 1, you can use half, which I usually tell teams that your WIPs should not total to more than the number of people on your team, but you can use any of those and start there. So that's one way.
Let's talk about a lot about that, because there's so much stuff that you've packed into those 3 or 4 sentences that you just said there. First and foremost, I want to amplify what you were saying about being wrong. The whole point of the work in progress limits is to get teams to ask the right questions sooner. Anybody who's been in one of our Kanban classes know we say this all the time. It's all about getting you to ask the right questions sooner. So really think about those work in progress limits, not necessarily as hard and fast rules. I mean, they kind of are, but they really aren't. They're not really hard and fast rules. They're more a guide to conversations. If we're over that WIP limit, why? If we're under that WIP limit, just as importantly, if we're under that WIP limit, why? And those are the types of questions we should ask. Okay, so now Prateek said, okay, we can set a policy, that nobody on the team should be working on more than X number of things at a time. And so you said the 2 things, we don't want them working on more than 2 things at a time. That kind of makes sense to me. Why would a team ever choose half? Like a policy that is I'm only working on half of that. How do I only work on half a thing? How does that work? Why would I ever do that?
Why would I just leave my work half done, right? It's actually the opposite. It's you're still working on only one thing. It's just that multiple people are working on that one thing. That's encouraging that pairing, swarming, collaboration, that sort of behavior to say, this thing that, as I said initially, we only usually have in the developing column, developers working, people who write code. We want more folks to work in different areas so that they can be mentored by other developers. They should be there. We want QAs to jump in and start writing test cases ahead of time, or even how to code this stuff, them to jump in. Many a time our analysts get backed up. So let's send some developers over, some QAs over to start writing test cases with them. So when your WIP limit is your board-wide total WIP is under the number of people, you're actively encouraging people to be working together on items at different points of time.
So we'll get to that board-wide WIP limit here in just a second, because that's yet another thing I think we need to talk about. But to hopefully kind of wrap this up, what you just said, that's how you initially, right? What Prateek is talking about is how you initially set those work in progress limits. But as we've said already twice before, those initial setting of work in progress limits are going to be wrong. And as the team actively manages their work, as Prateek was saying, whether we're swarming on it, whether we're whatever we're doing, as we violate work in progress limits, or maybe as we're under work in progress limits, from time to time, that's going to necessitate the team getting together to change their WIP limits based on their observations of how flow is going, as well as some metrics that they're tracking. We can use probably an example of one of your teams here in just a second, in terms of how they did that, how they went across that. Okay, so that's column level work in progress limits. So remember, you can set them per column. You're going to be wrong. You're going to need to change them. That's probably going to be the recurring theme here. But you mentioned something else. Now you mentioned kind of a board-wide WIP limit. What's that, and why would I do that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, if I'll send most of our viewers back to our discussions on Little's Law. And in Little's Law, when Dr. Little talks about average WIP, it's not necessarily talking about the average WIP of a subsystem. It's talking about the average WIP of the entire system that things are going through. Now, obviously, Little's Law applies at the subsystem level as well, but in general, what he's talking about is what we would consider the entire system. And that is why that board-wide WIP, how many things are in progress throughout the entire board that we care about at any point of time, might be even more important than how many things are in a particular column, because that's when you start applying the concepts behind Little's Law, all the assumptions and everything else across the entire work stream. So having a board-wide WIP limit, in essence, what that means is I have these 5 columns on my board. I don't ever want more than 10 things, whatever that is, whatever that number is, on this entire board at any point of time. That would be the board-wide WIP limit. There are pros and cons to it, which we'll get into it in a little bit. But Dan, what do you have to say about board-wide WIP limit?
Yeah, a lot of you maybe have heard a pejorative thrown around about board-wide WIP limits. I think some people like to call it, I think it's called proto-Kanban. I think that's the term that they use, to kind of get across the idea that, hey, that's not quite Kanban. When I would argue, number one, that's in many, if not most cases, the best place to start, the best place by far to start. And number two, potentially is, as much as you'll ever need in terms of limiting a work in progress and setting a work in progress limit is, if we truly want the team to work as a team, one of the best ways to do that, I would argue, is to set that board-wide work in progress limit, and for the team to understand that, hey, I don't care where stuff is, in our process, the whole team is subject to this work in progress limit. So let's be respectful of that, and let's do whatever we can to make sure that we are within that self-imposed limit. So that, I guess that's kind of starting to get into the pros of a board-wide work in progress limit. What are some other pros, and what are some cons of that board-wide WIP limit?
And the other pros, well, you mentioned it already, but I think it bears repeating. Just like we talked about when the WIP limit is below the number of people on the team, a board-wide WIP limit again fosters that culture of collaboration and that pairing and swarming and getting things through a lot more. A con, though, is it is possible for a team to say, we've got 10 things in the first column, our board-wide WIP limit is 10, so we're good. And then these same 10 things move to the next column, and then these same 10 things move to the next. So it is possible for the team to get into a pseudo waterfall type mentality with that board-wide WIP limit. It'll be hard because most things don't move together like that, but it is possible. That's definitely one con.
Well, so yeah, so let's talk about that specific case, because I think this is a great time to talk about your experience with your team and how that kind of not quite, but kind of happened on your team. You essentially, I'll set the stage and you correct me where I'm wrong. You essentially had a board-wide WIP limit. It was really more a per person work in progress limit, if I remember correctly. But that's essentially a board-wide WIP limit. And you notice work piling up in a specific column. You started to kind of see that kind of batching effect. So can you tell us how you solved that, where we had the board-wide WIP limit?
Yeah, we saw a ready for QA column. We had a particular column ready for QA, and things would batch up there, and people will just wait for the QA experts to kind of pull that forward and work it through. And we still had the policy that no one person can work on more than one thing at any given time, and most people were actually paired up. But it did, because we allowed more things than people on the board wide, it allowed things to batch up in that ready for QA column. So what the next step we took was, this isn't working. We're not being responsible here. Let's actually put a WIP limit on that ready for QA column. I think we initially put a WIP limit of 5, then we changed it to 3, then we changed it to 2. And we kept pushing that WIP limit down to kind of ensure that things were still flowing and we did not have a backup in that column, because that's where we saw the backup. So you could use both.
Yeah, that's why I want to make sure people understood is essentially what that was a hybrid approach, right? Where there was this board-wide policy around how people could work on items, but then to avoid that kind of pile-up batching effect, you went even further. You went a step further and said, okay, this is where we're seeing work pile up. This is where we're seeing there's a problem with our flow. We want to specifically control that, and so we put a WIP limit there. And And again, I thought you glossed over the most important part where you were talking about how you ratcheted it down. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
we kept
your first attempt, what you said was, I think, 5. Was it a
5.
5?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So your first attempt was 5, and you realized, well, okay, 5, we still weren't responsive. At
Yeah.
5, that was still way too high.
And there were always 5 things in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we were like, okay, if I want to reduce the number of things in there, if 5 reduced it from X to 5, reducing it to 3 will reduce from 5 to 3.
And
So,
and that's what happened. And then you went
then
down.
further, we went to 2, we went to 1.
And to me, that's one of the best lessons, I think, from limiting work in progress is you can usually go much, much, much lower than you think that you
Yeah.
can. I know a lot of people are afraid, and because it is so, we say this, it's unintuitive. It's unintuitive to the point of being counterintuitive, that it's actually good to work on less things, but you can usually go much lower than you think that you can. And it's really, really hard for teams to trust that. But I don't know, just do it. Try the experiment. Just like Prateek said, they tried a number that didn't quite work. And so when the number doesn't quite work, you don't push the number up, you push the number down. Right.
Yeah.
So you go from 5 to 3 to 2, and then you find, right, hopefully you'll find where that, for lack of a better word, equilibrium is with
Yeah,
that balance.
I do want to I want to reemphasize the point that you were making, that behavioral human cultural point, kind of, that we have been taught and we have been praised for multitasking and working on multiple things and taking on a lot of stuff, and that's why it feels very unintuitive to say I'm going to work on fewer things, or we as a team are going to work on fewer things. And um, if we get to this question today, we also got a question about teams not trusting metrics, or hesitant about using these metrics. I
Yeah,
think
that'll
it
probably.
kind of, yeah, that cultural that cultural influence kind of gets towards that too, if we get to that question today.
Yeah, my guess is that'll probably be another episode.
Another one.
So we've all right. So we've actually talked about several strategies so far when initially setting work in progress limits. There's the column based ones where you can kind of pick a policy. There's the board level one, which again is still kind of policy based. There's the kind of variation on the board level one, which is a policy per person, like Prateek said. Well, maybe we don't really kind of have a board wide one, but we have this policy that no one person can work on more than one thing at a time. And then there's a hybrid, where maybe we have a board wide policy and a per column policy. All of those are perfectly valid, and anything in between that you can think of, any permutation in between those are absolutely valid too. So instead of maybe one board wide WIP limit, say that 10 times fast. Maybe only several columns are grouped together under a work in progress limit, and then maybe you have per column limits, the rest of the way. Maybe if you have swim lanes on your board, maybe you're limiting WIP per swim lane.
Yeah.
There's all of these are valid. Now, depending on the context, some may be better than others. The idea of, for example, the idea of having a swim lane per person and then limiting work in progress that way, that's starting to get very, very, very non-collaboratively-ishness, whatever the word is I'm looking there, which may not necessarily be a good thing. But from a Kanban perspective, and this is the ultimate point that I wanted to make, from a Kanban perspective, Kanban doesn't care. All Kanban says is that you have to control work in progress somehow. That's what you have to do. How you do it, that's completely up to you. As long as you're limiting work in progress, as long as you're controlling work in progress, and as long as you are fairly regularly reviewing those WIP limits to adjust and improve flow.
And one thing I'll add to that, and you mentioned this earlier, which was, it's not, and that's why I think that's why you changed it from limiting to controlling work in progress. It's not just that your WIP limit is as high as you go. It's also that you don't want to be too far under it either. You don't want to be in a spot where you're either starving the system or you are overflooding the system. So that number is where your team operates at its optimum, at least what we believe. We'll
Yeah.
change that number over time. Yeah.
I'm wondering if that should be an episode on its own. Maybe leave us a comment if you want us to do an episode on. Most people are familiar with the dangers of going over work in progress limits, but hardly anybody understands the dangers of being under those work in progress limits. That's actually just as potentially more dangerous than being over work in progress limits. So leave us a comment if you'd like us to do an episode on that, because a lot of people treat those work in progress limits more as I think the more technical term is called cap WIP. That's the highest it can go. It can be any number under that work in progress limit, but that's the highest it can go. And that's not necessarily how work in progress limits and pull systems are supposed to work. Not necessarily. But yeah, let us know if you'd like us to do an episode on that. So I don't know, Prateek, what else do we have to say about WIP limits, or should we wrap it up? Should we give you the last word? What?
I mean, I think we've said a lot. We should definitely recap it.
That's all right. Let's recap it.
The theoretical answer is it doesn't matter how you're limiting WIP as long as you're controlling WIP. The practical answer is whichever method you choose, start somewhere, observe flow, and know that you're going to be wrong, and then change things as you move forward. Pick a number, start with it, and then just know that you're going to be wrong and continue to change it.
Yeah, that reminds me. I can't believe I didn't say this before. And I think I got this from Don Reinertsen, but please forgive me, Don, if I'm misquoting you, or if this was not you, and if it was somebody else. So my apologies. But one thing I heard is if you're really just starting out, one of the best things you can do is just literally map out everything that you have in progress right now on your board. And as your starting point, just cut that in half.
Cut it in half, yeah.
And that's your starting point in terms of what your WIP limit should be. And maybe you keep going through that exercise until you get your WIP levels to something manageable. So like I said, I think I got that from Don Reinertsen, but I'm not sure. But that's something else to think about. In fact, there's a team I'm working with right now that's exactly what they did. Well, what we did, we mapped out all their stuff, and we actually went a little bit lower than half. But that's a great place to start, as good as any, right? So, and maybe that's how we should wrap it up, right? I think that's what you were saying is.
That's a great way to wrap it up.
Just pick something, try it, and because remember, you can always change it. Not only can you change it, you should be changing it.
Yeah.
Okay. I always say I'm going to give you the last word, but then I usually take the last word.
I think that's as much of a tradition as starting with the whiskey.
I think so. We should leave it at that. For the beautiful Nisha in the background, as captivating as always.
Enthralled.
For Prateek Singh, the Yogi Berra of Agile. No Yogi Berra-isms tonight.
No,
we got to work on that.
I mean, WIP, work in progress, you could easily do something there.
Yeah, you could have. You totally could have, but you didn't. You missed your opportunity.
How much work you have in progress at any point of time.
Yeah, nope, it's too late. You missed it.
Too late.
My name is Daniel Vacanti. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next episode. Goodbye, everybody.